Good afternoon. I'm Mark Bernstein, and I'd like to take a few minutes to think about characters, especially characters in fictions in which readers take a hand in deciding who's who and what's what. All fictions are like that, but interactive fiction makes the interaction more visible. We can begin with one crucial observation. The man standing in front of the room and dressed in black is not the Prince of Denmark. He does not speak Danish. He has no views on taxation. He has no fond childhood memories. He never was a child. He has perhaps 1,000 lines of iambic pentameter, and that is all. Yet, somehow, that isn't all. People are complicated. Characters are complicated. You'd expect that a convincing computational character would need to know an awful lot. Because psychological modeling is difficult, many early creators avoided it by avoiding characters. That's one reason so many of our first adventures had depopulated landscapes. And when we're not depopulated, a lot of the time, we're filled with zombies and orcs and other inarticulate bad guys whom we are free to slaughter. The literary arts thrive on rich, credible characters. We know Hamlet and Frodo and Joe March and Hermione Granger. But how does that work? I mean, literally. How can we know anyone, much less someone who doesn't actually exist? A lot of scholarship in the second half of the 20th century explored how we understand signs and texts. Texts broadly construed to include games and pictures and advertisements. One key realization was that the reader is always doing a lot of work. In order to make sense of a simple text, you need a lot of knowledge and experience. Another crucial new understanding is that texts aren't inert lumps of information. Texts have power. They talk to each other. A body of text becomes a discourse, and that discourse shapes the way the world is understood. A further key insight is that our experience of a work is not frivolous or personal or idiosyncratic. It is what it is, and that is all that we have. So, it seems we need a bunch of AI to model a character's conscious and subconscious thought, and we also might need to understand the audience whose construction of meaning mediates everything. And that audience might be 2,500 years in the future. How can we possibly even begin to do this? There is no artificial intelligence in this statue, but I would suggest that there is a good deal of character. Look at how the maiden takes the leverage away from death. And notice that Death, while he is certainly not going to let go, is completely patient. He has all the time in the world. While she is holding off his arm, the maiden is also resting her head against Death's shoulder. And we get this without buckets of exposition. There is no voice acting, no backstory, no use of dialect. We don't rely on underlying IP. You don't have to have seen the movie, but Death and the Maiden is computationally simpler even than Hamlet. After all, it's a rock. Crucially, apprehension, or construction, that is, construal, of character is shared between the text and the reader. It's not exclusively in the stone, but it's not exclusively or capriciously in the viewer. We are, in fact, inclined to treat everything that asserts personhood as a person. People tend to be polite to their computers if the computers engage them in dialogue. In fact, we may know as much about Joe March or Jane Bennett as we know about our neighbors or our colleagues. That, in fact, is one of the keys to character, simply claiming to be one. Now, we can lean harder on what readers bring to the story by taking advantage of characters that everyone already knows. As a result, we see lots of games with brave elven archers and strong warriors who had troubled childhoods. Indeed, much of what makes so many of today's games childish is the uncritical embrace of thoroughly worn roles. Borrowing familiar characters saves work and avoids artistic risk, and it can work extraordinarily well. We can always adopt a familiar framework, like Little Red Riding Hood, otherwise known as Arneson Thompson 333. Little Red is a situation and a goal, demonstration of sexual hygiene, of course. The girl herself can be anyone. So can the grandmother. How do we convert anyone into a specific someone in a particularly memorable telling? Alongside Barthes and Foucault and Derrida, in our pursuit of the study of text in the late age of print, we really must place Larry Gygax. Few books of its era were more influential, and none of those were so badly written. But D&D brilliantly captured the era's desire for narrative automaticity and provided a framework with which a generation of thoughtful writers has entered into dialogue. The driving innovation of Dungeons & Dragons was its random encounter tables, complete with improbable narrative probabilities. The implicit promise of a D&D adventure was that the dice determined what would happen, and that almost anything could happen. Narrative automata have always been deeply interested in the construction of character. We've already seen some aspects of this. Here's where it begins, literally in constructing a character, mostly random characteristics based on rolling dice. Dice rolling means that most characters are average. You can work with that. In fact, it's the central point of Lev Grossman's The Magicians. Random characteristics do have a major drawback. Many stories don't concern average people. They concern extraordinary people faced with extraordinary problems. Specific people faced with specific problems. If you're expecting the player to be a hero, dealing with a dolt is going to be a stretch. Random abilities are fundamentally unromantic. In romance, the hero wins through thanks to her intrinsic wonderfulness. Random abilities fight against that. An early, more romantic counterpart to D&D sought to replace innate abilities by constructing each character's backstory. This argues that you can be anything you want to be, whoever you are, but you can't be everything. You can have a doctorate in astrophysics, but then you can't be 13. We see this quite often in games that emphasize a sorting hat, decision points where the player expresses who they want to be. And a core problem here is that many stories depend on bringing a particular character into a specific situation. Romeo and Juliet won't work if Juliet is earthy and sensible. This was not an entirely new problem. William Wallace Cook was a hack writer in the 20s. He wrote adventure, science fiction, romance, Western screenplays. If you could pay, he could write it and fast. Plotto is his index of plots and conflicts, and it's a hoot. Plotto's conflict table is a big digraph of conflicts, cross-indexed by the sort of character they required. For example, 696 only requires a protagonist. It can follow 715C or 695B, but it doesn't have to. It can be followed by 823. Plotto assumes that the writer will prefer to draw characters through incident. The alternative is a bucket of exposition, which often throws cold water on the opening of the story. About the same time as Cook was writing Plotto, Wycliffe Hill released his own index, The Plot Genie. Need an unusual female character in a hurry? Plot Genie has a table for that. Pick a random number from 1 to 180. Plot Genie will save the day. This is unusual women considered as wandering monsters. Wandering monsters provide only a temporary narrative drive. They give you impromptu, unexpected challenges, but if that's all there is, the story becomes one damn thing after another. We can get some interesting behavior from behavior trees and finite state machines. Production rules and behavioral grammars can get you some part of the way. This has led to lots of very fascinating work. As M. Short has been able to show in practice as well as theory, moderately simple logic and a nice slug of suspension of disbelief can get you a very long way. When a system asserts personhood, we tend to grant it. Similarly, if a system claims to be intentional, purposeful, we tend to invent theories that explain its clever behavior. These red knots did not, in fact, hold a team meeting before this shot to develop a play where they seem to change colors because everyone turns right on the count of 3. For example, think about the Cane Mutiny. It generates disaster from a missing pint of strawberry ice cream on a U.S. Navy minesweeper in the middle of World War II. Herman Wouk makes that seem natural and inevitable. Automata have trouble with that range of inventiveness, so their concerns have tended to focus on tactics and wandering monsters. The limits of behavior trees and grammars become more problematic the more they improve. As the illusion gets better, the cost of error can grow. That's why in the theater, We sit and are silent, while in general the actors stand and speak. Other arrangements are possible. In Punchdrunk Sleep No More, the audience wear masks and the actors don't. It's silent and through danced. There are many actors in many rooms, and the audience wanders among them. One remedy to the automata's difficulty with direction is simply to establish the bones of the stories in advance. I call this a framework automaton. The question isn't how things end up, but how we get there. The plot of My Life with Master is pretty well fixed. It's that kind of movie. What's interesting is how we get there, precisely how we balance love and self-loathing, fear and compulsion to attain a better world. The hero can tell us who they are, or we can learn who they are by watching the reaction of the world as they move through it. Either strategy will work, but each is challenging when the reader's active construction is manifest. Returning for a moment to Wandering Monsters, I think this is a good time to touch on a pernicious fix to a pernicious fault. In the old days, heroes of games were white males. That wasn't good. Nowadays, you can often choose your race and gender. This presents an alternative theory of race and gender, that they don't really matter. Often, no one in the game world notices. But this is false to experience. It's just not easy being green. The question of the race of computational characters is exquisitely complex. Consider Opal Young-Ai, Rachel Aaron's protagonist. She's a Korean princess living in a futuristic mythical Detroit. She has a computational sidekick named Sybil. Sybil is clearly white, but of course, being a disembodied computational sidekick, she isn't white at all. Or consider Martha Wells' android security agent, a cyborg who thinks of himself as Murderbot. Humans tend to assume that he'd like to spend more time with people. This is a common trope from Pinocchio to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, from A Logic Named Joe to Star Trek's Data. But Murderbot doesn't like people. They're his job. What he really likes is binge-watching soap operas alone. Or consider Heinlein's Friday, or its redaction by Charles Stross, Saturn's Children. Friday is an artificial human in a world that resents artificial humans. The book concerns her efforts to pass. Stross recasts Friday more candidly as a sex robot, built to love people and to be loved by them. Unfortunately for Stross's Friday, humans are now extinct. Friday knows exactly why she was created, but she cannot do that for which she was intended. The gap between the flaneur and the voyeur is not always clear or safe. Postmodernism, particularly in the work of Baudrillard, reminds us that we can construct rigged games, simulacra, that offer fake authenticity that confirm and valorize the audience's ignorance and prejudice, and we know where that can lead. As you see, we have piled trouble on trouble, and that's before we mention the Twitter toxicity of the YA world, or class. Identity tourism is a hazard. Racial erasure is a hazard. D&D, remember, was built on the colonial story. We're going into other people's houses and stealing their treasures. Steve Wallace remediates this in No Country for Old Kobolds. His kobolds are short-lived, fragile communitarians fighting to preserve their land. Individuals will fall, but the community may perhaps be saved from these foreign marauders. The town becomes the protagonist, jointly constructed by the players. Ryutama is an automaton that's intended to tell a different kind of story, one of a fundamentally benign world in which we may have discomforts and occasional privations, but in which we generally can rely on parents and friends and guardian dragons. Drama comes from unexpected, but not necessarily dangerous, surprises. Plato elucidated character through conflict. But here, as in many non-Western narrative structures, we scarcely have conflict. What we have is shopping and eating and meeting new people and creatures and pets. We might have a rainstorm or a disagreement, and that's significant, but it's not the main point. Jason Morgenstar's Fiasco isn't precisely Hono Bono, and it's all about conflict. Everyone is always at odds with everyone, but it too winds up with a 4-act structure in which the tilt is the pivot. This doesn't look much like D&D, but it establishes a lot about Eddie. Like D&D, it's mostly the result of dice rolls with various tweaks. A key to Fiasco is that everything is plausible in isolation, but can easily become hilarious when faced with ambitious people and bad choices. We are these days fond of power fantasies, but much progress in narrativist tabletop games in the past decade has been in narratives of the powerless. Little Fears is a serious role-playing game about little kids and the monster in the closet. Jason Blair here turns belief into the pivot of the game. The monster in the closet is real, and it's really bad, and only children know how bad, and only children can see the monster. If a character believes her doll is a weapon against the nameless horror, then her doll is a weapon against the nameless horror. Little kids are better at this, so in Little Fears it can be helpful to be very little. Put differently, Little Fears is a world in which belief really is the path to salvation. This is not a cute, harmless entertainment. Dogs in the Vineyard is a very strange and very thoughtful game. Its players are inquisitors who have been sent out to enforce spiritual conformity in a remote region of a mythical American West. The players are asked to enforce a belief system that, in this world, is literally true. If you mess up the liturgy, then demons will show up at your doorstep. Real, actual demons. Just like if you leave the cheese out for a day or two on the counter, mold will grow. But readers don't literally believe this. The result is a world in which players are alienated from their characters, and this is an extremely interesting move. Or take Night Witches, the story of the Soviet 588th Night Bomber Regiment, staffed entirely by women flying outdated biplanes against the invading Nazis by night and trying to outwit the Red Army and the NKVD by day. We're at war with everyone. It's formally a travel story, from here to Berlin, or more likely, from here to eternity. We are replete with writing prompts, often extreme, that reveal character. What is being done to keep livestock off the runway, and why isn't it working? Postmodernism cast so much doubt on sentimental certainties that it was unclear for a time back in the 90s how history or truth could be justified. Trivialization of the Holocaust proved to be the answer to that problem. Some certainties did survive the 20th century, because we knew some things, at least, were true. Munslow was right about romance and farce, but in fact not quite right, because of course Warsaw was also a place of romance and farce, because everywhere is. In Jason Morningstar's Grey Ranks, for example, the player characters are teenagers fighting the occupation. For any character, the game probably ends in either derangement, depression, martyrdom, a nervous breakdown, or something even worse. This is serious, but it's also true in a way that a sentimental power fantasy would not be true. In conclusion, I'd like to look at a question that much concerns me, which is, how ought we to treat our characters, especially as our characters grow more vivid? Let's take immersive digital stories seriously. Let's think, for example, about the consequences of Hamlet on the holodeck, and think about Ophelia. If we ourselves are to be Hamlet, what about Ophelia? Sure, in the theater, Ophelia drowns 7 nights a week and twice on Saturdays, but that's none of our affair. But when we're on the holodeck, it is precisely our fault. We're Hamlet. We can do things. For example, perhaps we can be better to Ophelia. Perhaps the answer is to propose to her. Might that lead to a better outcome? Can it? Can Ophelia possibly consent? Remember, immersive storytelling means that by definition we are beyond the Turing threshold, give or take a healthy dose of suspension of disbelief. Though it might be better for us to take Ophelia back to our dorm room in Wittenberg, is she capable of saying yes? If she is not, then what is it that we're doing? But even if she can consent, isn't her consent coerced? Ophelia exists only for our entertainment. If she does not consent, she may drown, and she will certainly return to the shadows whence she came, to dust and bits. Dishonesty in art is tricky. Fiction isn't real. Stories are a lie. We excuse that when, in some ways, the stories are more true than reality. But open dishonesty, including story choices that don't change the story or that present good acts as bad and bad acts as good, are clearly problematic. Cruelty to characters is still cruel. This is the first of 3 talks I've been planning this year to explore characters in computing. It will likely be a book eventually. I've been leaning on a lot of friends and colleagues for help, and I'd like to thank them. Of course, all the mistakes are mine, and thanks to all of you for your patience. Uh, the reading list for this deeply compressed talk, it's at markbernstein.org. And I believe it's also linked from the talk schedule